She'll come, Malcolm Hayes said with a smirk as he lifted his champagne glass. Trust me, people like Arya never miss a chance to see what they lost. Laughter rolled across the private lounge inside the luxury hotel where his wedding rehearsal dinner was already underway. A few guests exchanged knowing looks. Others smiled politely. One woman leaned closer and asked, "You really invited your ex-wife?" Malcolm laughed again. "Of course I did. What's the point of winning if nobody sees it?" More laughter followed. Nobody defended her. Nobody questioned him. To everyone in that room, the story had already ended years ago. Malcolm was the success. Arya was the mistake he left behind. What none of them knew was that the woman they planned to humiliate was already becoming the most important person in the room. Malcolm just hadn't realized it yet. Across town, a cream-colored envelope rested on a polished conference table. Arya Bennett stared at it in silence. The gold lettering on the front looked expensive, arrogant, predictable. Around her, the meeting room had gone quiet. Her assistant had stopped speaking. Even the senior advisor sitting near the window seemed more interested in the envelope than the multi-million-dollar documents spread across the table. Arya opened it carefully. Inside was a wedding invitation. Malcolm Hayes and his future bride. The date. The venue. The celebration of a life he wanted everyone to admire. Folded behind the invitation was a handwritten note. Arya unfolded it slowly. Her eyes moved across the page once. Then again. She said nothing, but the muscles in her jaw tightened. "Everything okay?" her assistant asked softly. Arya folded the note and placed it back into the envelope. "I'm fine." She wasn't. The note wasn't an invitation. It was a performance, a reminder, a deliberate attempt to reopen old wounds. Malcolm wanted her sitting in that ballroom watching him celebrate. He wanted her to see the life he believed she could never have. He wanted witnesses. That was the cruelest part. Not the divorce. Not even the betrayal. The audience. Because humiliation always felt worse when people were watching. 3 years earlier, Arya had stood beside Malcolm when nobody else believed in him. She worked late nights, missed opportunities, delayed her own ambitions. She believed their success belonged to both of them. Malcolm had promised the same thing. Then success arrived. Money arrived. Recognition arrived. And somehow the woman who helped build his future became someone he no longer wanted standing beside him. The divorce papers came shortly after. Cold. Efficient. Final. Malcolm didn't just leave. He made sure she understood that he believed she would never matter without him. That memory still stung. But not as much as the note lying inside the envelope. Because even now, after everything, he still thought he knew exactly who she was. That was his mistake. A very expensive mistake. Arya looked through the glass wall of the conference room. Below, traffic moved through the city like streams of light. Her phone vibrated once on the table. Then again. A third time. She glanced at the screen. The message disappeared before anyone else could read it. Her expression didn't change. But the senior advisor across from her noticed something. For the first time since opening the invitation, Arya smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had just confirmed a suspicion. Malcolm thought she was arriving alone. He had no idea how wrong he was. He had no idea there were people already rearranging schedules because of a wedding invitation. He had no idea there were names connected to Arya now that even he would recognize. Most importantly, he had no idea that the version of Arya he remembered no longer existed. Back in the hotel lounge, Malcolm raised another toast. Guests applauded. Cameras flashed. Conversations filled the room. He looked completely relaxed, completely certain, completely convinced that the story belonged to him. What happened next would challenge every assumption he had built over the last 3 years. Arya slid the invitation back into its envelope and stood. "Cancel Saturday," one executive said immediately. Another nodded. "Should we move the board meeting?" Arya picked up her coat. "No," she replied calmly. "Keep everything exactly where it is." Then she paused at the door. "And clear my schedule Sunday morning." Nobody asked why. Nobody dared. As she walked out of the room, her phone vibrated one more time. This time, The message contained only 6 words. Arya read them once before locking the screen. The smile returned. Small, quiet, dangerous. Because somewhere in the city, Malcolm Hayes was planning the happiest day of his life. And somewhere much closer than he realized, the first pieces of his surprise were already moving into place. Long before the luxury hotels, the magazine covers, and the carefully staged smiles, Malcolm Hayes had been just another ambitious man with more confidence than cash. Back then, he lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment with peeling paint near a busy highway. The air conditioner barely worked in the summer. The kitchen light flickered every few days. Yet whenever Malcolm talked about the future, his eyes lit up as if he could already see the skyline bending to his will. Arya Bennett saw it too. That was the problem. She believed him. While Malcolm chased investors, Arya worked extra hours. While he attended networking events, she stayed home reviewing spreadsheets, fixing presentations, and helping him prepare for meetings. She never asked for credit. She never asked for recognition. She thought they were building something together. One night, years before anyone knew Malcolm's name, he came home frustrated after another failed pitch. He threw his jacket onto the couch and dropped into a chair. "They think I am dreaming too big," he said. Arya looked over the notes spread across the table. She spent nearly an hour reading through them. Then she quietly pointed to 3 mistakes in his proposal. Malcolm stared at her. "You think that is the problem?" She nodded. "You are asking them to trust your vision. They need a reason to trust your numbers first." The next week, he used her suggestions. The meeting changed everything. The investor signed. The first real money arrived. Malcolm celebrated. Arya smiled. Neither of them knew that moment would become one of the foundations of his future empire. Years later, nobody remembered her role in that room. Not even Malcolm. Success came faster after that. New contracts appeared. New opportunities followed. Their apartment became a townhouse. The townhouse became a mansion. Expensive watches replaced discount store accessories. Business magazines started calling Malcolm a rising star. At first, he thanked Arya publicly. He introduced her proudly. He told people she was his partner in every sense of the word. Then the invitations started arriving. Private parties, charity galas, exclusive networking events filled with executives, investors, and socialites. Something changed. It happened gradually. So gradually that Arya almost convinced herself she imagined it. Malcolm stopped asking her to come. He said the events were boring. He said she would not enjoy them. He said he was trying to protect her from unnecessary pressure. Then one evening she discovered photos online. Malcolm stood smiling beside people she had never met. She had not even known the event existed. When she asked him about it, he brushed it aside. It was last minute. The excuses continued. The distance grew. The man who once called her his greatest supporter slowly began acting as if she no longer fit into the picture he wanted the world to see. Arya remembered one particular evening more clearly than the others. A business celebration was being held at a country club outside the city. Malcolm reluctantly agreed to let her attend. At first everything seemed normal. Then she overheard a conversation. 2 guests standing nearby glanced in her direction. One of them smiled politely. The other did not bother hiding her opinion. "That is his wife?" the woman asked. "I expected someone different." The response came with a laugh. Success changes people. Sometimes their partners cannot keep up. Arya stood frozen. She waited for Malcolm to say something. Anything. A correction. A defense. A simple acknowledgement. Instead, he looked away and continued talking to an investor as if he had heard nothing. That silence hurt more than the comment itself. It told her everything she needed to know. Looking back, that was probably the moment the marriage truly started falling apart. Not because strangers judged her, because Malcolm allowed it. Across the city in the present day, Malcolm sat in another private gathering surrounded by admiration and attention. He laughed easily. He spoke confidently. Every person at the table treated him like the most important man in the room. He enjoyed every second of it. What he did not know was that somewhere in his own business network, People had already begun mentioning a mysterious organization that seemed to appear wherever major opportunities emerged. The name surfaced in conversations, in boardrooms, in investment circles. Nobody seemed to know who controlled it, but everyone respected it. Malcolm had heard the rumors. He simply never paid attention. He believed there were no players left capable of surprising him. That assumption was about to become a problem. Because while Malcolm spent the evening celebrating himself, Arya was staring at the wedding invitation one last time before placing it inside a drawer. Her phone vibrated again. Another message. Another update. This time she read it twice. Then she closed the drawer and turned off the office lights. Somewhere not far away, a piece of information was moving toward Malcolm. A small detail. Easy to ignore. Easy to dismiss. But once he saw it, doubt would enter the story for the very first time. The first crack in their marriage did not come from a scandal, a dramatic argument, or some life-changing disaster. It came from silence. The kind of silence that slowly replaced conversations, explanations, and affection. A few days after the country club incident, Arya tried to convince herself she was overreacting. People said careless things all the time. Maybe Malcolm had simply not heard the comment. Maybe he had been distracted. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. But deep down she already knew the truth. The problem was not what strangers thought of her. The problem was what Malcolm no longer bothered to correct. As the months passed, small moments began piling up. He stopped asking for her advice before important meetings. He stopped sharing details about deals. Sometimes she would learn about major developments in his company from business websites instead of from her own husband. Each incident seemed insignificant on its own. Together, they painted a picture she could no longer ignore. Malcolm was building a new version of his life, and Arya was slowly disappearing from it. One evening, she arrived at a charity event after receiving a last-minute invitation from one of Malcolm's colleagues. She was surprised she had not heard about it sooner. The ballroom sparkled beneath crystal chandeliers. Executives and investors moved through the crowd carrying glasses of champagne. When Arya entered, she immediately spotted Malcolm standing near the stage. Beside him was a group of influential guests. She started walking toward him. Then she heard her name. That must be her. The voice came from a woman standing nearby. Who? Another guest asked. Malcolm's wife. The first woman glanced toward Arya. She does not exactly match the image, does she? Several people exchanged awkward smiles. One man chuckled softly. Another simply shrugged. Arya felt heat rise into her face. Not because of the insult, because Malcolm was standing close enough to hear every word. Their eyes met briefly across the room. For a second she expected him to step forward, to defend her, to remind everyone she belonged beside him. Instead, he turned back toward the investors and continued his conversation. The message could not have been clearer. Later that night, as they drove home, Arya sat quietly in the passenger seat. Malcolm seemed unusually cheerful. He talked about new opportunities and future expansion plans. Finally, she asked the question she could not keep inside any longer. Did you hear what they said? Malcolm's smile faded. About what? At the event. He sighed. Arya, do we really need to do this? Do what? Turn every little thing into a problem. She stared at him. They insulted me. Malcolm tightened his grip on the steering wheel. You care too much about what people think. The answer hurt more than an argument would have, because it confirmed exactly what she feared. He had heard. He simply did not care. From that point on, the distance between them grew faster. Malcolm spent more nights away, more weekends at conferences, more dinners with investors. Arya remained supportive, but something inside her had changed. The trust that once felt unbreakable now carried small fractures. In the present day, Malcolm sat inside his downtown office reviewing preparations for the wedding. Everything was running smoothly. The guest list included influential executives, politicians, athletes, and celebrities. The event was already being discussed across social circles. Exactly the kind of attention he enjoyed. His assistant stepped into the office carrying a folder. There is something you should probably see. Malcolm barely looked up, What is it? A report from one of the investment groups we have been tracking. He opened the folder casually. Inside were several pages discussing a rapidly growing financial organization that seemed connected to multiple successful acquisitions. Malcolm skimmed the document without much interest. Then he froze. Near the bottom of one page sat a signature. Just initials. Nothing more. Most people would not have noticed them. Malcolm did. The letters looked strangely familiar. For a brief moment, a memory flashed through his mind. Old notebooks, business plans, handwritten notes spread across a kitchen table years ago. He frowned. Then he shook his head. Impossible. The idea vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Anything important? His assistant asked. Malcolm closed the folder. No. He pushed it aside. Just another company trying to make noise. Yet after the assistant left, he found himself staring at the folder again. Something about it bothered him. Something he could not quite explain. Across the city, Arya stood alone beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office. The skyline stretched endlessly before her. Her phone rang. She answered without hesitation. The voice on the other end delivered a brief update. Arya listened quietly. Then she asked a single question. Has he seen it? A short pause followed. Yes. For the first time that evening, Arya allowed herself a small smile. Because Malcolm Hayes had just experienced something he had not felt in years. Doubt. And he still had no idea how much worse things were about to become. For the first time in years, Malcolm Hayes carried a question he could not immediately answer. It annoyed him more than he wanted to admit. The initials on that report should have meant nothing. They were only 2 letters at the bottom of a page. Yet they lingered in his thoughts long after he left the office. During meetings, he caught himself thinking about them. During dinner with his fiancée, his attention drifted. Even while reviewing final wedding preparations, the memory returned again and again. The feeling irritated him because uncertainty was unfamiliar territory. Malcolm built his reputation on confidence. He trusted his instincts. He trusted his judgment. Most of all, he trusted his belief that he understood people. And when it came to Arya Bennett, he believed he understood her completely. In his mind, her story had ended 3 years earlier. Back then, there had been no dramatic confrontation, no screaming match, no public scandal. The end came quietly, which somehow made it even colder. Malcolm still remembered the afternoon he placed the divorce papers on the kitchen table. Sunlight streamed through the windows. The house was silent except for the ticking of a clock in the hallway. Arya stared at the documents for several seconds before speaking. You already made your decision. It was not a question. Malcolm nodded. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. After everything? He hated that question. Not because it was unfair. Because it forced him to acknowledge things he preferred not to think about. People change, Arya. The answer sounded reasonable at the time. Professional. Detached. Efficient. Arya lowered her eyes toward the papers. That is what you are calling this. Malcolm crossed his arms. I am being honest. In reality, honesty had very little to do with it. The truth was simpler. Success had changed the way he saw the world. It had changed the way he saw himself. And eventually, it changed the way he saw his wife. Arya no longer fit the image he wanted beside him. He never said those words directly. He did not need to. His actions said enough. The worst part was not even the divorce itself. It was what came afterward. Mutual friends slowly disappeared from Arya's life. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations became awkward. People chose sides without ever saying so openly. Most chose Malcolm. Why would they not? He was successful, influential, visible. Arya became a footnote in a story everyone assumed was already finished. Malcolm noticed it. He benefited from it. And he never once tried to stop it. Back in the present, Malcolm sat alone inside his office after everyone else had left. The city lights glowed beyond the windows. He opened the folder again. The report remained exactly where he had left it. He flipped through the pages until he found the signature. Those initials stared back at him. Familiar. Uncomfortable. For a moment, another memory surfaced. Years ago, before the money and the recognition, Arya used to leave handwritten notes on business plans. She often signed them the same way. Malcolm stared at the page. Then he laughed quietly to himself. It was ridiculous. Plenty of people shared the same initials. The idea that Arya had anything to do with a rapidly expanding financial organization was absurd. At least that was what he told himself. Across the city, Arya sat inside a private conference room surrounded by advisors. A large digital display showed charts, schedules, and upcoming commitments. Nobody mentioned the wedding directly. They did not need to. Everyone understood its significance. One advisor reviewed security logistics. Another discussed travel arrangements. A third outlined several meetings scheduled for the following week. Arya listened carefully. Then she pointed toward one section of the schedule. Move that meeting to Monday. Done. And the acquisition review. Already handled. The room moved with remarkable efficiency. Not because people feared her, because they respected her. Years earlier, Malcolm believed Arya could not succeed without him. If he could see her now, he would not recognize the woman sitting at the head of that table. Yet even now, nobody in the room referred to her achievements publicly. Her name remained absent from headlines, absent from interviews, absent from public attention. That was intentional. The mystery protected something far more valuable than recognition. One of the advisors received a message and checked his phone. His expression changed slightly. "What is it?" Arya asked. One of Malcolm's companies just submitted an offer on a property. Several people exchanged glances. And the advisor hesitated. The property owner declined immediately. "Why?" Another advisor smiled. "Because they accepted our offer yesterday." Silence filled the room. Then a few people laughed softly. Not because Malcolm had lost a deal. Because he still had no idea who he was competing against. Arya remained calm. She showed no satisfaction, no arrogance, no celebration. She simply closed the folder in front of her. "Anything else?" she asked. The advisor nodded. "There is one more thing." He slid a photograph across the table. Arya picked it up. The image showed the entrance of Malcolm's wedding venue. Workers were setting up decorations. Luxury vehicles lined the curb. Preparations were nearly complete. Arya studied the photograph for several seconds. Then she placed it back on the table. Her expression never changed. But everyone in the room noticed something. The atmosphere shifted. The countdown no longer felt theoretical. It felt real. Because after years of distance, silence, and assumptions, Malcolm Hayes was finally moving toward a moment he could not control. And somewhere inside his office, the folder containing those familiar initials remained open on his desk. He would look at it again before the night was over. The question would return. The doubt would grow. And very soon, he would discover that the woman he dismissed years ago had left behind far more than a signature. Long before anyone associated Arya Bennett with quiet confidence or hidden influence, there was a period when simply getting through the week felt like a victory. Malcolm never saw that chapter. He never asked about it. And if he ever imagined it at all, he probably assumed she spent those years regretting the life she had lost. The truth was far less comfortable. After the divorce, Arya moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city. The building was old. The walls were thin. Every sound from neighboring units seemed to travel through the hallways. For the first time in years, she lived completely alone. The silence that followed was harder than she expected. During the day, she focused on practical problems. Rent, bills, work, survival. At night, the questions arrived. Had Malcolm been right? Had she sacrificed too much of herself for a future that was never really hers? Had she wasted years helping build someone else's dream while neglecting her own? Those thoughts followed her everywhere. Yet the hardest part was not losing money. It was losing people. Friends who once filled her phone with messages slowly disappeared. Invitations stopped coming. Conversations became shorter. Some people chose Malcolm openly. Others simply drifted away. The result was the same. One by one, familiar faces vanished from her life. There were mornings when Arya sat alone with a cup of coffee staring at job applications and wondering how everything had fallen apart so quickly. More than once she considered giving up on ambitious plans altogether. A stable position, a quiet routine, a smaller life. It would have been easier. One afternoon, nearly a year after the divorce, she scheduled a meeting with an executive she had known through Malcolm's network. The man had once praised her intelligence and professionalism. Arya believed he might be willing to help. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. After listening politely, he folded his hands on the desk. "I think you are talented," he said. "But I also think your best opportunities were connected to Malcolm's success." Arya remained silent. "People see him as the visionary," he continued. "You should probably focus on rebuilding something smaller." Smaller. The word stayed with her long after she left the building. It was not the rejection itself that hurt. It was the certainty behind it. The assumption that her value had always depended on someone else's name. That evening, Arya sat alone in her apartment staring at the city skyline through a narrow window. For the first time since the divorce, tears filled her eyes. Not because she missed Malcolm, because she was exhausted. Exhausted from proving she deserved a chance. Exhausted from hearing polite versions of the same message. Nobody expected her to succeed. Nobody believed she could build anything significant on her own. The next morning, she woke up with a decision. She would stop asking for permission. If the doors remained closed, she would find another entrance. The breakthrough came months later in the most unexpected way. Arya had spent countless hours studying overlooked sectors of the market. Areas larger firms ignored because profits seemed too small or risks appeared too complicated. Most people dismissed these opportunities. Arya saw patterns, connections, potential. One evening, she discovered a trend hidden inside a collection of reports nobody else seemed interested in reading. She reviewed the numbers once, then twice, then a third time. The opportunity was real. The problem was simple. Acting on it would require nearly everything she had left. At the time, her savings account was nowhere near large enough to absorb a major loss. Failure would set her back years. Success could change everything. For several nights, she barely slept. She ran calculations, studied projections, challenged her own assumptions. Every answer led back to the same conclusion. The risk terrified her because it made sense. Eventually, she made her decision. She committed. There was no celebration, no dramatic announcement, no applause, just paperwork, uncertainty, and the uncomfortable realization that she had placed her future on a bet most experts would never make. Back in the present day, the countdown to Malcolm's wedding continued. Vendors finalized schedules. Guests confirmed attendance. Social media buzz surrounding the event grew stronger by the day. Malcolm remained focused on appearances, unaware that several developments were unfolding beyond his view. In a private office across the city, one of Arya's advisors entered a conference room carrying a folder marked confidential. "We received another inquiry," he said. Arya looked up from the documents in front of her. "From whom?" He mentioned a name. A very influential name. One that would have impressed nearly anyone in the business world. Arya's expression remained calm. "What do they want?" "A meeting. Schedule it after the weekend." The advisor nodded. Then he hesitated. "There is something else." Arya closed the folder she was reviewing. "Go ahead." "Someone connected to Malcolm's circle has started asking questions." The room grew quiet. Not alarmed. Interested. Arya considered the information for a moment. How much do they know? Almost nothing. She leaned back in her chair. Then let them keep looking. The advisor smiled slightly. Because everyone in that room understood the same thing. Malcolm Hayes was finally searching for answers. The problem was that he was still looking in the wrong direction. And somewhere inside a locked cabinet, preserved among years of records and forgotten documents, sat a file connected to Arya's very first successful move after the divorce. A file that could explain everything. A file that nobody outside her inner circle was supposed to find. But someone was getting closer. The file sitting inside that locked cabinet represented the most dangerous period of Arya Bennett's life because it documented the moment she decided to risk everything. If that investment had failed, nobody would have remembered her name. There would have been no growing influence, no confidential meetings, no mysterious organization attracting attention across financial circles. There would only have been another story about a divorced woman who gambled on a dream and lost. Years earlier, after weeks of research and sleepless nights, Arya transferred nearly everything she had left into an opportunity most experts considered too uncertain. The numbers made sense to her. The timing made sense. The long-term trend made sense. Yet logic offered very little comfort when her future depended on a single decision. The day after she committed her money, the market moved in the wrong direction. Then it moved further. Every headline seemed designed to destroy her confidence. Analysts predicted losses. Commentators questioned the sector. Investors rushed towards safer alternatives. Arya sat alone in her apartment reviewing reports until 2 in the morning, searching for evidence that she had made a mistake. The pressure became unbearable. For several days, she barely ate. She barely slept. Every notification on her phone felt like a threat. She remembered standing in her small kitchen one evening staring at the city lights beyond the window and wondering whether Malcolm had been right all along. Maybe she had overestimated herself. Maybe the people who dismissed her had seen something she could not. Maybe she was about to lose the last piece of stability she still possessed. Then something happened. Not a miracle. Not a sudden windfall. A detail. A small shift hidden inside a larger trend. Most people ignored it. Arya did not. She recognized the signal immediately because she had spent months studying information nobody else cared to examine. The data confirmed her original conclusion. The opportunity remained intact. The fear remained too. But for the first time, confidence returned. She stayed the course. Several weeks later, the market reversed, then accelerated. What began as a calculated risk transformed into her first major victory. The profit itself was significant. The lesson mattered more. Arya realized she could trust her own judgment. She did not need Malcolm's approval. She did not need validation from former friends. She did not need permission from people who believed her best years were behind her. She only needed discipline, patience, and the courage to continue. That success became the foundation for everything that followed. Back in the present, Malcolm sat inside a conference room listening to a presentation he normally would have dominated with complete confidence. Today felt different. One of his advisors was discussing recent market movements and competitive activity. Several organizations were expanding aggressively into sectors Malcolm considered strategically important. Most names meant very little. One did not. The mysterious organization kept appearing. Different deals. Different regions. Same pattern. Same reputation. The companies seemed to arrive quietly and leave with valuable assets before anyone fully understood what had happened. Malcolm leaned back in his chair. Who was running this operation? He asked. Nobody had an answer. No public founder. No. No interviews. No. No public leadership structure. Nothing we can verify. Malcolm frowned. Successful people usually enjoyed attention. Visibility created leverage. Influence created opportunities. Yet whoever stood behind this organization appeared completely comfortable remaining invisible. The behavior made no sense to him. After the meeting ended, he remained alone in the room reviewing the documents again. His eyes stopped on another familiar detail. Those initials. The same initials that continued appearing throughout multiple reports. A coincidence. It had to be. Yet the explanation no longer felt as convincing as before. Across the city, Arya entered a private dining room reserved for a confidential meeting. A man already waited inside. He was older, respected, and powerful enough that many executives spent years trying to secure his attention. As Arya approached, he stood immediately. "Good to see you again," he said warmly. "You as well." They shook hands. The interaction was brief but revealing. Equal, professional, respectful. No one observing the conversation would have mistaken Arya for someone rebuilding her life after failure. The meeting lasted less than an hour. When it ended, the man walked her to the exit personally. Several employees noticed. None understood the significance. Inside the car waiting outside, one of Arya's advisors reviewed messages on a tablet. "Anything urgent?" she asked. "One thing." He handed her the screen. Arya scanned the information quietly. A source connected to Malcolm's company had requested access to older records tied to a transaction from years earlier. The same transaction documented inside the locked file. The same transaction connected to her first major success. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the advisor asked the question everyone was thinking. "Do we stop them?" Arya looked out the window as the city passed by. Her answer came without hesitation. "No." The advisor raised an eyebrow. "No." A calm smile appeared on her face. "Let them keep digging." Because the deeper Malcolm searched, the closer he moved toward a truth he was not prepared to face. And hidden among thousands of ordinary documents sat the first piece of evidence proving that the woman he once called dependent had quietly begun building a future far beyond anything he ever imagined. The strange thing about power was that most people imagined it announced itself loudly. They expected headlines, interviews, award ceremonies, and public recognition. What they rarely noticed was how often real influence operated quietly, almost invisibly, until the moment it became impossible to ignore. That was exactly how Arya Bennett preferred it. Years earlier, after the success of her first major investment, she could have stepped into the spotlight. She could have built a personal brand. She could have attached her name to every deal and every victory. Instead, she chose a different path. She stayed behind the curtain. She allowed the results to speak while she remained absent from the conversation. At first, people barely noticed. Then they started asking questions. A small investment group appeared in one market. Months later, it quietly acquired assets nobody else wanted. A year later, those same assets multiplied in value. Then another transaction happened. Then another. The pattern repeated so consistently that experienced investors began paying attention. Nobody knew exactly who controlled the organization. Nobody knew who made the final decisions. Yet everyone understood one thing. Whoever stood behind it was remarkably intelligent. The mystery became part of the reputation. The less information available, the more curiosity grew. Meanwhile, Arya continued operating from the shadows. She surrounded herself with experts, lawyers, analysts, strategists, advisors, people who cared more about results than publicity. Many of them had never met Malcolm. Some barely knew anything about her personal history. They respected her for a much simpler reason. She was usually right. Back in the present, Malcolm sat in a private dining room with several executives discussing upcoming opportunities. The wedding was only days away. Normally, that fact would have dominated the conversation. Instead, the mysterious organization surfaced again. One executive mentioned a recent acquisition. Another referenced a negotiation that had unexpectedly collapsed. A third described a project that disappeared before competitors even realized it was available. Different industries, different locations, same invisible player. Malcolm listened quietly. "Has anyone actually met the founder?" someone finally asked. The table fell silent. No one had an answer. One executive laughed. "At this point, I am starting to think the founder does not exist." A few people smiled. Malcolm did not, because the same uneasy feeling from earlier returned. The initials, the reports, the repeated references. None of it made sense. Yet he could not ignore it anymore. After dinner, he returned to his office instead of going home. The building was nearly empty. Most employees had already left for the evening. He unlocked a cabinet containing archived documents and began reviewing old files connected to transactions from years earlier. At first, the search produced nothing. Then he found a familiar folder. The date matched the period shortly after his divorce. Curious, he opened it. Several pages later, he stopped. His eyes narrowed. There it was again. The same initials. Not once. Multiple times. Notes. Recommendations. Analysis. The handwriting was unmistakable. Malcolm stared at the pages. A strange sensation settled over him. Not fear. Not yet. Something closer to discomfort. The possibility that a story he considered finished might not have ended the way he believed. Across the city, Arya sat with her advisors reviewing preparations for the weekend. A large screen displayed schedules, transportation routes, security plans, and meeting updates. Everything moved with precision. One advisor entered carrying a tablet. "We have confirmation." Arya looked up. "From whom?" He mentioned the name of a highly respected investor. Another influential figure had accepted an invitation connected to an upcoming private gathering. Then another. Then another. The list continued growing. Arya reviewed it without visible excitement. To everyone else in the room, however, the significance was obvious. Important people rarely adjusted schedules for events they considered unimportant. Yet many of them were making accommodations. One advisor smiled. "The interest is stronger than expected." Arya placed the tablet aside. "Good." Another advisor hesitated before speaking. "There is one more update." "Go ahead." Someone accessed the archived records. The room grew quiet. Arya already knew who that someone was. "How much did he find?" she asked. "Not enough." A faint smile appeared on her face. Exactly as expected. Malcolm was finally pulling on a thread. The problem was that he still did not realize how large the tapestry behind it had become. One discovery would lead to another. One question would create three more. The deeper he looked, the harder it would become to preserve the version of reality he preferred. Outside, the city lights reflected across the glass walls of the conference room. The wedding weekend was approaching rapidly now. Invitations had been sent. Guests were arriving. Rumors were spreading. And somewhere inside his office, Malcolm Hayes sat alone staring at documents that should not have mattered. Yet for reasons he could not explain, he kept turning pages. Because hidden between ordinary reports and forgotten records was the first real proof that the woman he once dismissed had never stopped moving forward. And buried even deeper was a name connected to her organization that Malcolm would recognize immediately if he ever found it. The moment he did, doubt would no longer be enough. The week of the wedding arrived faster than anyone expected. Luxury vehicles began appearing outside hotels across the city. Guests flew in from different states. Social calendars shifted. Private dinners filled exclusive restaurants. Everywhere Malcolm Hayes looked, people seemed excited about the event. It was exactly the reaction he wanted. Yet despite the attention surrounding him, he found it increasingly difficult to enjoy it. The unanswered questions kept returning. 2 days before the ceremony, Malcolm sat in his office reviewing final arrangements when another report landed on his desk. Normally, he would have delegated the task. This time he opened it himself. The document contained updates on several recent acquisitions completed by the same mysterious organization that had been appearing in conversations for months. One section caught his attention immediately. A project his company had attempted to secure the previous year had quietly slipped away during negotiations. At the time, Malcolm blamed bad timing. Now he discovered the winning bidder had been connected to the same invisible network. He continued reading. Another missed opportunity appeared. Then another. Then another. Individually, none of them seemed significant. Together, they revealed a pattern. Someone had been operating in spaces Malcolm considered his territory. Someone who consistently stayed one step ahead. His phone rang. It was one of his senior executives. "You need to hear something." Malcolm leaned back in his chair. "What happened?" "There are rumors circulating among several guests arriving for the wedding." Malcolm frowned. "What kind of rumors?" A short pause followed. "People are talking about a very influential figure who may attend." Malcolm almost laughed. Important guests attended high-profile weddings all the time. And nobody knows who it is. That is hardly unusual. This is different. The executive lowered his voice. Several people adjusted travel plans after hearing the name. Malcolm sat quietly. What name? Nobody knows. The answer only deepened his frustration. The conversation ended a few minutes later, but the uneasiness remained. For the first time, he felt as though events were moving around him without his control. Across the city, preparations were unfolding at a very different pace. Inside a secure conference room, Arya reviewed the final weekend schedule with her team. Transportation routes had been confirmed. Meetings had been rescheduled. Security arrangements were complete. The atmosphere remained calm, but underneath that calm sat a growing sense of anticipation. One advisor placed a tablet in front of her. Guest arrival updates. Arya scanned the screen. Several prominent names appeared. Some were expected. Others were not. She handed the tablet back without comment. "Any issues?" she asked. "None." Another advisor smiled. Interest continues growing. Arya looked toward the window. The city stretched across the horizon beneath a bright afternoon sky. 3 years earlier, she could not have imagined this moment. Not because of wealth. Not because of influence. Because she had survived long enough to reach it. The wedding was no longer simply a social event. It represented the final chapter of a story Malcolm believed he had already finished. Her phone vibrated softly. A message appeared from a trusted contact. She read it once before locking the screen. One of Malcolm's associates had been asking more questions, digging deeper, looking for connections, looking for answers. They were still far away from the truth, but they were getting closer. One advisor noticed the slight change in her expression. "Something important?" Arya nodded. "Not yet." The response confused several people in the room. "Not yet." The words lingered after the meeting ended. Later that evening, Malcolm attended a private gathering with several high-profile guests arriving ahead of the ceremony. Conversations flowed easily. Music played softly in the background. Laughter echoed across the room. Yet Malcolm found himself distracted. During one conversation, he overheard two investors discussing the same mysterious organization. "I heard they are expanding again. Everyone wants to know who is behind it. Whoever it is, they have connections everywhere." Malcolm pretended not to listen. Then one of the men added something unexpected. Apparently, the founder received multiple invitations this weekend and declined all of them except one. Malcolm's attention sharpened immediately. "Which event?" he asked casually. The two investors exchanged glances. One shrugged. Nobody seemed certain, but the answer bothered him anyway. Because for the first time, he considered a possibility he had not taken seriously before. What if the unknown figure everyone discussed was closer than he realized? What if the same person connected to those reports was somehow linked to the questions already haunting him? The thought sounded ridiculous, yet he could not dismiss it. Hours later, long after the gathering ended, Malcolm stood alone on the balcony of his penthouse overlooking the city lights. The wedding was less than 48 hours away. Everything should have felt perfect. Instead, he found himself staring into the distance thinking about initials, reports, rumors, and a woman he believed he understood years ago. Somewhere else in the city, Arya prepared to leave her office for the evening. As she walked through the lobby, employees greeted her respectfully. Outside, several dark vehicles waited near the entrance. She paused briefly before stepping forward. One advisor approached. "Everything is ready." Arya nodded. "Good." Then she glanced toward the skyline one last time. Because the next time Malcolm Hayes saw her, nothing about the situation would unfold the way he expected. And somewhere among the arriving guests, the first person capable of turning his confidence into genuine doubt had already landed in the city. The morning of the wedding arrived beneath clear skies and a level of excitement that spread through the city long before the ceremony officially began. Luxury vehicles lined the entrance of the five-star hotel hosting the event. Staff moved quickly through polished hallways. Florists made final adjustments. Photographers prepared equipment. Guests in designer suits and elegant dresses filled the lobby with conversation. Everything looked exactly the way Malcolm Hayes wanted it to look. Perfect. Controlled. Impressive. By early afternoon, the ballroom buzzed with energy. Influential business leaders greeted one another. Investors exchanged handshakes. Politicians, athletes, and media personalities drifted through the crowd. Everywhere Malcolm looked, he saw proof of his success. This was the audience he wanted. These were the people he hoped would witness the next chapter of his life. Yet even while accepting congratulations, He found his attention drifting toward the main entrance. The feeling annoyed him. He should have been focused on the celebration. Instead, part of him kept wondering whether certain rumors would prove true. Several guests had already mentioned the possibility of an unexpected arrival. No one could provide details. No one seemed to know anything concrete. Yet the speculation continued. Across the ballroom, conversations rose and fell like waves. "Did you hear?" one executive whispered. "Hear what?" "Someone important may be attending." The second man laughed. "At a wedding like this, everyone thinks someone important is attending. Not like this." Similar conversations appeared throughout the room. Small comments, curious glances, unanswered questions. Nobody seemed certain of anything, but anticipation had quietly entered the atmosphere. Meanwhile, several miles away, Aria Bennett sat inside the rear seat of a black SUV, moving through downtown traffic. Her expression remained calm. Outside the windows, the city passed by in a blur of glass, steel, and sunlight. Inside the vehicle, silence dominated the space. One advisor reviewed messages on a tablet. Another monitored updates arriving in real time. No one appeared nervous. They had prepared for this day for weeks. Aria glanced at her phone. The screen displayed several missed calls from numbers she did not recognize. She ignored them. Her focus remained elsewhere. Not on Malcolm. Not on revenge. Not even on the wedding itself. Her focus rested on something much simpler. Closure. 3 years earlier, she had walked away carrying uncertainty, disappointment, and unanswered questions. Today, she intended to leave all of that behind. The SUV turned toward the hotel district. Behind it, another vehicle followed. Then another. Then another. The convoy moved smoothly through traffic. Nothing flashy. Nothing theatrical. Just organized. Professional. Intentional. Back inside the ballroom, Malcolm greeted another group of guests when one of his executives approached quickly. "You might want to see this." Malcolm frowned. "See what?" The executive leaned closer. Several arrivals just changed their schedules. So, they were originally planning to attend another event. Malcolm stared at him. "And now they are coming here." The answer should have felt reassuring. Instead, it deepened the strange feeling already growing in his chest. Before he could respond, movement near the entrance drew attention from several guests. Conversation slowed. Heads turned. Nothing unusual happened at first. Then more people looked toward the doors. The reaction spread gradually across the room. One cluster of guests became 2, then 3. The energy shifted. Curiosity replaced routine conversation. Outside the hotel, the first black SUV rolled to a stop near the entrance. Hotel staff immediately straightened. Valets exchanged quick glances. Security personnel adjusted positions. The second vehicle arrived seconds later. Then the third. Then the fourth. By the time the convoy finished arriving, a noticeable crowd had gathered near the entrance. Nobody knew exactly who was inside, yet everyone understood one thing. Whoever had arrived was not ordinary. Inside the ballroom, whispers accelerated. Several guests stepped closer to the lobby area. Others checked phones. Some simply watched. Malcolm remained where he stood, trying to maintain composure. The scene irritated him more than he wanted to admit. This was supposed to be his moment, yet attention was beginning to move elsewhere. Outside, doors opened. Men and women dressed in professional security attire stepped from the vehicles. Calm, alert, disciplined. They spread out naturally around the entrance. Not aggressively, not dramatically, simply doing their jobs. The effect on the crowd was immediate. Hotel employees became quieter. Guests became more curious. Several people exchanged surprised looks. One investor standing near the entrance blinked twice before speaking. Who exactly is arriving? Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. Not yet. Inside the ballroom, Malcolm felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The feeling made no sense. There was no threat, no problem, no reason for concern. Yet the uncertainty continued growing. Then his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. A message from one of his advisors appeared. 4 words. "She is here." Malcolm looked up immediately. Around him, Conversations were fading. Across the ballroom, dozens of eyes remained fixed on the entrance. Outside, one final vehicle rolled forward and stopped. The rear door remained closed for several seconds. Long enough for anticipation to build. Long enough for silence to spread. Long enough for an entire room to hold its breath without realizing it. And when that door finally began to open, Malcolm Hayes experienced something he had not felt in years. Unease. The ballroom seemed to stop breathing as the final vehicle door opened. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Every eye remained fixed on the entrance. Then Aria Bennett stepped onto the pavement. The reaction was immediate. Not loud. Not dramatic. Something far more powerful. Silence. The kind of silence that spreads through a crowd when expectations collide with reality. Malcolm felt it before he fully understood it. 3 years ago, he had watched Aria leave his life carrying a single suitcase and a future nobody believed in. The woman approaching the entrance now looked nothing like the version he remembered. She moved with quiet confidence. Calm. Composed. Completely unaffected by the attention surrounding her. The security professionals positioned nearby adjusted naturally as she approached the doors. Not because she demanded it, because they were accustomed to protecting someone important. Inside the ballroom, whispers erupted. Is that her? That is Malcolm's ex-wife. What is happening? Malcolm's fiancée noticed the shift immediately. Guests who had been focused on the ceremony moments earlier were now watching the entrance instead. Some stepped away from conversations entirely. Others moved closer for a better view. The atmosphere changed in ways no event planner could control. Aria entered the ballroom without rushing. She did not pause for attention. She did not attempt to make a statement. Yet somehow every step became a statement anyway. Several guests recognized her immediately. Others did not. But even those who had never met her could sense something unusual. People with genuine influence carried themselves differently. Confidence without performance. Authority without effort. Respect without explanation. Malcolm watched from across the room. Unease tightened inside his chest. This was not how he imagined the moment. He expected discomfort. Maybe embarrassment. Maybe awkwardness. Instead, Aria appeared completely at ease, as though she belonged there more than anyone else. Then the first surprise arrived. An older investor standing near the front of the ballroom suddenly smiled. Without hesitation, he walked directly toward Aria. Conversations stopped as guests watched the interaction unfold. The man extended his hand immediately. It is good to finally see you again. Aria returned the handshake warmly. Likewise. Several nearby executives exchanged confused looks. They knew the investor. Everyone knew the investor. He rarely approached people first. Yet here he was greeting Malcolm's ex-wife with obvious respect. Before anyone could process it, another guest approached. Then another. Then another. The pattern became impossible to ignore. One respected figure after another moved toward Aria. Not because they were curious. Because they already knew who she was. Malcolm's stomach tightened further. Across the room, his assistant appeared beside him. Do you know what is happening? Malcolm asked quietly. No. It was the first time all day his assistant sounded uncertain. The answer irritated him. More importantly, it worried him. Meanwhile, Aria remained calm despite the growing attention. She exchanged brief greetings. Short conversations. Professional smiles. Nothing excessive. Nothing arrogant. Yet every interaction seemed to produce the same reaction from observers. Surprise. Confusion. Curiosity. Why were so many influential people treating her this way? The question spread through the ballroom faster than any rumor. Then came another moment nobody expected. A nationally recognized business leader entered through a side entrance and immediately scanned the room. Several guests attempted to greet him. He acknowledged them politely before continuing forward. His destination became obvious seconds later. Straight toward Aria. The room watched in disbelief. Thank you again for your help, he said as he reached her. The project exceeded every expectation. Aria smiled. I am glad it worked out. The exchange lasted less than 20 seconds. Yet the impact was enormous. Guests who overheard. The conversation began whispering immediately. Malcolm heard fragments. Project, partnership, success, respect. None of it made sense. Not yet. Across the ballroom, people who had ignored Aria's arrival were now actively trying to identify her. Phones appeared. Quiet searches began. Questions multiplied. Malcolm felt something unfamiliar settling over him. Anxiety. The sensation grew stronger when he realized something else. The attention in the room was shifting. Slowly but undeniably. The wedding remained important. The ceremony remained scheduled. Yet conversations increasingly revolved around one person. Aria. The woman he invited expecting humiliation had somehow become the center of attention before the ceremony even began. Then a member of the hotel staff approached one of the event coordinators and whispered something. The coordinator's eyes widened immediately. Within moments, the information spread to several influential guests. Each reaction looked remarkably similar. Surprise followed by excitement. Aria noticed the change, but said nothing. Malcolm noticed it too. His pulse quickened, because whatever information had just arrived seemed to matter. A lot. Across the ballroom, another group of distinguished guests began moving toward Aria. Not casually, deliberately, as though they did not want to miss an opportunity. Malcolm watched the scene unfold in growing disbelief. 3 years ago, he believed she would disappear into the background of his story. Now his own guests were treating her like someone far more important than he could explain. And standing near the center of the ballroom, Aria remained perfectly calm because she already knew something Malcolm did not. The biggest revelation of the day had not happened yet. In fact, the truth powerful enough to turn confusion into shock was only minutes away from entering the room. The atmosphere inside the ballroom changed from curiosity to anticipation. Guests were no longer asking whether Aria Bennett was important. They were trying to understand how important. Conversations that had once revolved around Malcolm Hayes and his wedding had shifted almost entirely toward the woman standing calmly near the center of the room. Malcolm felt it happening in real time. Every glance, every whisper, every subtle change in body language. Control was slipping away from him, and he did not understand why. Across the ballroom, a member of the event staff approached the stage coordinator and handed over a sealed envelope. The coordinator opened it, read the contents, and immediately looked towards several distinguished guests seated near the front. His expression changed. Within moments, a quiet discussion began among people whose opinions carried enormous weight in business circles. Malcolm watched from a distance. Something was happening. Something significant. Then one of the most respected investors in the country stood and walked toward the microphone. The movement attracted immediate attention. Conversations faded. Guests turned toward the stage. Even the photographers adjusted positions. The investor smiled politely before speaking. Before today's ceremony continues, there is someone in this room I would like to recognize. Malcolm frowned. This was not part of the schedule. Around the ballroom, guests exchanged confused looks. The investor continued. Many of us have benefited from opportunities created by a visionary leader who prefers to remain out of the spotlight. A person whose judgment has shaped transactions, investments, and partnerships worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The room became completely silent. Malcolm felt his pulse quicken. Across the room, Aria remained perfectly calm. The investor turned toward her. Most people know the organization. Very few know the person behind it. Several guests inhaled sharply. Others immediately understood where the speech was heading. The investor smiled. Today seems like the appropriate moment to correct that. Every eye in the ballroom shifted toward Aria. Malcolm stared in disbelief. No, that was impossible. The investor raised his glass. To Aria Bennett, founder and principal architect of Bennett Strategic Holdings. The reaction was instant. Shock spread through the room like electricity. Conversations exploded. Phones appeared. Names were searched. Faces changed. Guests who had only been curious moments earlier suddenly looked stunned. Because they knew the organization. They knew the influence. They knew the reputation. They simply never knew who stood behind it. Malcolm felt the floor beneath him disappear. Bennett Strategic Holdings. The name hit him harder than he expected. He knew that organization. Everyone in his industry knew it. It had quietly acquired assets, influenced markets, funded major projects, and partnered with some of the most powerful figures in the country. For years it had operated like a mystery. Now the mystery had a face. And that face belonged to his ex-wife. "That cannot be real," someone whispered nearby. Another guest quickly replied, "It is real. I worked on one of their transactions." Across the ballroom, respected executives began approaching Arya again, this time with no hesitation at all. The uncertainty was gone. Recognition had replaced it. Malcolm watched as people he had spent years trying to impress greeted her with genuine admiration. Then came the second blow. A large digital screen near the stage illuminated unexpectedly. Several images appeared. Completed projects, acquisition announcements, strategic partnerships, major developments linked to Bennett Strategic Holdings over the past 3 years. The scale was impossible to ignore. Malcolm recognized several of them immediately. Some had once been opportunities he failed to secure. Others had directly impacted companies within his network. Every revelation deepened the shock. Around the room, expressions shifted from surprise to awe. Arya never moved toward the spotlight. She never asked for attention. Yet the attention arrived anyway. That made it even more powerful. Malcolm's mind raced through memories. The apartment, the kitchen table, the divorce papers, the assumptions, the certainty. He remembered telling himself she would never reach the same level without him. He remembered believing she needed his success to survive. Now every belief was collapsing at once. Then came the final piece. One executive standing near the stage smiled and addressed the crowd. "There is something else many of you do not know. Several companies represented in this room currently maintain active partnerships with Bennett Strategic Holdings." A murmur spread through the audience. The executive continued, "Including organizations connected to Malcolm Hayes." Silence followed. Complete silence. Malcolm felt every eye in the room move toward him. Not with admiration, with realization. For years he believed he stood above Arya. The truth was far more devastating. Without ever realizing it, he had been operating inside a world she helped shape. Across the ballroom, Arya finally met his gaze. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She did not seek revenge. She simply looked at him with the calm confidence of someone who no longer needed anything from him. In that moment, Malcolm experienced something stronger than doubt, stronger than unease, stronger than anxiety. Shock. Pure shock. Because for the first time, he understood the magnitude of his mistake. And as the applause around Arya grew louder, a terrifying realization settled into his mind. The woman he thought he had outgrown had become someone far beyond his reach. The worst part was that the revelations were not finished yet. The applause continued long after the presentation ended. Not because the crowd was being polite, because they were genuinely impressed. Conversations filled the ballroom again, but they sounded different now. The mystery had been replaced by understanding. Guests were no longer asking who Arya Bennett was. They were discussing what she had accomplished. Malcolm Hayes stood frozen in the middle of it all. The noise around him seemed distant, blurred, unimportant. His attention remained fixed on one person, Arya, the woman he thought he had left behind years ago, the woman he believed needed him, the woman who had somehow built an empire while he was busy congratulating himself for winning a divorce. For several minutes, he barely moved. He barely spoke. The realization settling over him felt heavier than embarrassment. Embarrassment faded. This was different. This was the painful understanding that he had been wrong for years. One of his business associates approached carefully. "Malcolm." He looked up. "What? Are you okay?" The question almost sounded ridiculous. Malcolm forced a smile. Of course. But neither man believed it. The associate hesitated before speaking again. "I had no idea she was connected to Bennett Strategic Holdings." Malcolm looked away. "Neither did I." The answer felt humiliating. Not because other people heard it. Because it was true. Across the ballroom, Arya continued speaking with several guests. She appeared relaxed, comfortable, entirely unaffected by the attention surrounding her. Watching her triggered memories Malcolm had not thought about in years. He remembered the small apartment where they started. He remembered late nights at the kitchen table. He remembered her reviewing contracts and business plans while he chased opportunities. He remembered the countless times she believed in him before anyone else did. Back then, he considered her support a guarantee, something permanent, something that would always exist no matter how he treated it. That realization hurt more than any public embarrassment ever could, because for the first time, Malcolm understood something obvious. Arya had not become successful overnight. Everything being celebrated today represented years of effort, years he never bothered to learn about, years he never asked about, years he assumed ended in failure simply because he wanted to believe they had. Nearby, another conversation caught his attention. Two investors were discussing Arya's achievements. One shook his head in disbelief. Her timing on those acquisitions was remarkable. The other nodded. The market still studies some of those moves. Malcolm listened quietly. Every compliment felt like another reminder of how little he actually knew about the woman he once called his wife. Then something unexpected happened. One of the older investors approached Malcolm directly. The man studied him for a moment before speaking. "You know, she used to talk about you often." Malcolm blinked. "What?" "Years ago." The investor smiled sadly. "She respected you." The words hit harder than Malcolm expected. Respected. Past tense. Not loved. Not admired. Respected. Something valuable that no longer existed. "She never spoke badly about you," the investor continued, "even when she had every reason to." Malcolm looked toward Arya again. A painful silence settled between them, because he remembered exactly how he treated her at the end. The comments he ignored, the humiliation he allowed, the assumptions he made, the invitation he sent. He had convinced himself the wedding invitation was harmless, a joke, a final reminder that he had moved on. Now he saw it differently. It was cruel, arrogant, unnecessary. For the first time all day, genuine regret appeared. Not because Arya was successful, not because the crowd admired her, because he suddenly understood how deeply he had underestimated her value long before any of this happened. Across the room, Arya finally found herself standing alone for a brief moment. Malcolm took a step forward, then another. The distance between them felt far greater than the few yards separating them. When he reached her, she turned calmly. Her expression remained neutral, neither hostile nor welcoming, simply calm. Arya. Hearing her name leave his mouth felt strange. She nodded politely. "Malcolm." For a moment, neither spoke. The ballroom continued moving around them. Laughter, music, conversations. Yet the silence between them felt louder than everything else. Finally, Malcolm exhaled slowly. "I did not know." Arya studied him for a second. "No," she replied gently. "You did not." There was no anger in her voice. Somehow that made it worse. Malcolm looked down briefly before meeting her eyes again. "I think I made a lot of mistakes." Arya remained quiet. He wanted to explain, to justify, to defend himself. Yet every excuse sounded meaningless. Nothing could change the years that had already passed. Nothing could erase the assumptions he built his life around. Nothing could undo the fact that he only saw her value after everyone else saw it first. "I was wrong about you," he admitted. The words felt heavier than he expected. Arya's expression softened slightly. Not with forgiveness, with understanding. "That was your choice." Malcolm swallowed hard. Because she was right. It had always been his choice. Every dismissal, every assumption, every moment he looked away instead of standing beside her. For the first time since the wedding began, he stopped thinking about reputation, appearances, or status. None of it mattered anymore. What mattered was the realization that the person he lost was never the problem. He was. And as Arya glanced toward the ballroom entrance, preparing to leave the conversation, Malcolm felt something even more painful than regret. Desperation. Because for the first time, he understood that success could not buy back what he had thrown away. And the way Arya looked at him made one thing painfully clear. She had already moved on. For a few seconds after their conversation ended, neither Arya nor Malcolm moved. The ballroom remained alive with music, laughter, and conversation, yet the moment felt strangely separate from everything happening around them. Malcolm stood there watching her, searching for something he could say that would change the outcome. An explanation, an apology, a second chance. The problem was that all of those things belonged to the past, and the past no longer belonged to Arya. She offered him a polite nod before turning away. The gesture was simple, respectful, final. Malcolm felt the weight of that finality immediately. Years earlier, he had convinced himself that leaving her behind was a sign of progress. Tonight, for the first time, he understood what he had actually left behind. Not an obstacle, not a chapter he outgrew. A partner who had believed in him before anyone else did. A person who saw potential in him when potential was all he had. The realization arrived too late. Across the ballroom, guests continued approaching Arya. Some wanted introductions. Others wanted conversations. Many simply wanted to express admiration. She greeted each person with the same calm professionalism she had shown throughout the evening. There was no arrogance. No desire to prove anyone wrong. That was part of what made the moment so powerful. She was not trying to win. She had already moved beyond the need to compete. One of her advisors approached quietly. "The vehicles are ready whenever you are." Arya glanced toward the entrance. "Thank you." The advisor nodded and stepped away. Nearby, several guests overheard the exchange and looked disappointed. One executive laughed softly. "Leaving already?" Arya smiled. "I have an early morning." The response triggered another wave of admiration. Years ago, she would have stayed searching for approval. Tonight, she carried herself like someone who no longer needed it. Malcolm watched from a distance. Every minute seemed to reinforce the same painful lesson. The life he spent years building around status and recognition suddenly felt much smaller than he remembered. Not because he lacked success, because success had become the only thing he truly valued. Arya had built something different, something deeper. Respect, trust, influence, relationships, a reputation people admired even when she was not in the room. Those things could not be purchased. One of Malcolm's closest business associates stepped beside him. "You should probably focus on the ceremony." Malcolm looked toward the ballroom floor. Guests were returning to their seats. Event coordinators were moving into position. Everything was proceeding according to schedule. Yet none of it felt the same. "Yeah," he replied quietly. The associate studied him for a moment. "You all right?" Malcolm forced a smile. "No." It was the most honest answer he had given all day. Across the room, Arya paused briefly near one of the large windows overlooking the city. The skyline glowed beneath the evening lights. For a moment, she allowed herself to reflect. Not on the wedding, not on Malcolm, on the journey itself. The apartment, the rejection, the sleepless nights, the meetings that led nowhere, the opportunities nobody else believed in. Every setback, every sacrifice, every difficult decision. She remembered standing alone years ago, wondering whether she would ever rebuild her life. Tonight, she finally understood something important. The victory was never about becoming richer than Malcolm. It was never about making him regret his choices. The victory was surviving long enough to discover her own worth. A quiet smile appeared on her face. Genuine this time. Peaceful. One of the younger executives nearby noticed. "You seem happy." Arya looked toward the skyline again. "I am." The answer surprised him because it sounded so simple. Yet it was true. Happiness no longer depended on proving anything. Meanwhile, Malcolm remained where he was, watching the woman he once believed would never succeed without him prepare to leave a room she had unintentionally transformed. The contrast felt impossible to ignore. He had invited her expecting to showcase his victory. Instead, the evening exposed a truth he spent years avoiding. Arya never needed him as much as he thought. He needed her far more than he ever realized. As she began walking toward the exit, conversations paused again. Guests smiled. Several offered farewells. Others stepped aside respectfully. The path opened naturally. No announcement was necessary. No dramatic gesture was required. Respect moved through the room on its own. Outside the hotel, the line of dark vehicles waited beneath the city lights. Security personnel prepared quietly. The atmosphere remained professional and calm. Arya stepped through the entrance and into the cool evening air. Behind her, the ballroom doors remained open just long enough for one final glance. Inside stood Malcolm Hayes, alone despite being surrounded by people, successful despite feeling defeated. She looked at him for a brief moment, not with anger, not with satisfaction, simply with acceptance. Then she turned away. The doors closed. The chapter ended. Minutes later, the vehicles pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the city. Inside the ballroom, the wedding continued. Guests returned to their conversations. Music resumed. Life moved forward. Yet for Malcolm, something fundamental had changed. The illusion that he had won was gone forever. And somewhere beyond the lights, beyond the headlines, and beyond the approval of strangers, Arya Bennett drove toward a future that belonged entirely to her. A future she built herself. A future no one could take away. And for the first time in many years, she did not look back.